The sky over the trade district of planet Cylon was a dark purple, lit only by the weak glow of twin moons. Commander Ray Travers walked quietly down the empty road, his boots making soft thuds against the metal ground. He wasn't on duty tonight. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to be here. But something had pulled him toward this forgotten part of the alien city, something he couldn't explain. A cold wind blew through the alleys, carrying strange smells. Most shops had shut down for the night. Neon signs blinked slowly, flickering as if struggling to stay alive. Ray pulled his jacket tighter around him and kept walking. There was no real reason to stay. He had already checked the systems for tomorrow's cargo drop. His ship was parked and ready, but still, he walked. Then he heard it. A sound so soft, so unexpected, that it made him stop. He turned his head slightly. It wasn't metal grinding. It wasn't the usual hum of power lines. No, it was a small voice. Not words, just a gentle, broken sound. Crying. Ray frowned. He stepped closer to a narrow alley and listened again. There it was, a soft whimper, followed by the sound of someone breathing fast, like they were afraid. Slowly, carefully, he stepped into the alley. Boxes and trash bins lined the path. Some of them moved slightly, like something had brushed past them. Ray put a hand on his sidearm just in case. He didn't want trouble, but this place wasn't safe at night. He knelt down and moved one of the boxes aside. What he saw made him freeze. 3 small figures were huddled together inside a broken crate. Their skin was a pale silver blue, and their eyes were large and glowing faintly in the dark. One of them had small, bony arms wrapped tightly around the other 2. They were children. Alien children. Cold. Thin. Scared. One of them whimpered again and looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. Ray held up both hands. "It's okay," he whispered. "I'm not going to hurt you." A soft noise behind him made him turn. Someone was there. A figure stepped out from the shadows, tall and thin, wrapped in a dark, tattered robe. Her face was tired, her eyes red and swollen, and her long silver hair hung down like wet threads. She looked at him with quiet desperation. Then, suddenly, her knees gave out, and she collapsed to the ground. Ray rushed forward and caught her before she hit the metal floor. "Easy," he said. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head slowly, her voice barely a whisper. "They haven't eaten in days." Ray looked back at the children. One of them had started to cry again, softly, trying to stay quiet. He helped the woman sit against the wall. She was shaking, not from pain, but from hunger, cold, and fear. "I'm Selvera," she said weakly. "Their mother." Ray nodded, still trying to make sense of what he had stumbled into. "Why are you out here? Why are they hiding like this?" Selvera looked down at her hands. "We lost our home. My mate, he died in the war. I couldn't work after that. My people, they don't care for widows. Not ones like me. I tried to get help, but no one would listen." Ray's heart tightened. He'd heard stories like this before, tales of abandoned families, ignored by their governments after the galactic wars. But seeing it like this, seeing her children trembling from cold and hunger, it hit him harder than he expected. "They'll take them from me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The authorities. They already warned me. If I don't find a male guardian before the next cycle, they'll say I'm unfit and take my babies away." Ray didn't know what to say. The wind blew again. The youngest child coughed, then curled tighter into a ball. Selvera turned to him, her eyes shining with silent tears. She reached forward slowly, as if scared he'd pull away. "Please," she said, voice shaking. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to marry me. Just help them. Let the system believe you're their guardian. Just pretend, so I don't lose them." Ray stared at her, shocked by the request. He was just a traveler, a human pilot. He didn't even live on this planet. He didn't know these children, this woman, or her culture. And yet, something inside him stirred. Maybe it was her broken voice. Maybe it was the way the children looked at him, not with trust, but with the last piece of hope they had. Or maybe he was just tired of watching the galaxy fail people like this. He sat down beside her, silent for a long time. Selvera wiped her face and held her arms open. The children crawled into her lap, too weak to cry now. "I don't want to die alone," she whispered. "But worse than that, I don't want them to grow up thinking they were never worth saving." Ray looked at the stars above. The wind had died down. The sky was quiet again. He took a deep breath, turned to her, and asked, "What do I have to do?" Her eyes widened. "Prove to the system that you're our protector," she said. "They'll check your record, your species, your intentions. They don't trust humans easily. But if you say you've taken us under your care, they can't take them from me." Ray looked at the children one more time. The oldest, a boy, met his gaze. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he nodded, just once, a quiet, powerful gesture of trust. Ray stood up, helping Selvera to her feet. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he said. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." But even as he led them toward the nearest shelter, Ray had no idea what was waiting for him next. Because someone else had been watching from the shadows, someone who didn't want this human to get involved. And soon, everything would change. Ray didn't sleep that night. He sat in the small metal shelter, watching the rain pour down outside. The alien world had a strange kind of rain, blue droplets that sparkled under the neon streetlights, falling with a soft fizz each time they touched the ground. Inside the shelter, it was dry, but the air still carried a chill that clung to the skin. Selvera sat across from him on a thin mat, her arms wrapped around her children. The youngest had already fallen asleep, face buried in his mother's chest. The older two stayed awake, eyes wide, still unsure if they were safe or not. Ray handed Selvera the last nutrition pack from his bag. She hesitated for only a second before opening it and carefully dividing it into 3 parts for her children. She didn't eat any herself. He noticed that. "You should eat something too," Ray said quietly. She shook her head, her silver hair falling over her face. "They need it more." Ray leaned back against the cold metal wall. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, full of questions that hadn't been asked yet. Ray had faced war zones. He'd flown through asteroid belts, fought pirates, negotiated with hostile tribes on backwater planets. But this was different. This was real life. Raw, unforgiving. Selvera finally looked up. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." "You didn't drag me," Ray said. "I walked into it." She nodded slowly, pulling her children closer. "You're kind. Most humans I've met, they don't stay long. They see us. They pity us. Then they leave." Ray didn't answer that, because he wasn't sure yet what kind of human he was either. "I meant what I said," she continued. "The system here is strict. No widow can raise younglings alone past the 2nd cycle unless she has a protector, a registered one. The council checks everything: backgrounds, loyalty, intentions. And if she fails," Ray asked, already knowing the answer, "they take the children, sell them to labor colonies, split them apart. Sometimes they disappear entirely." Ray's hands tightened into fists. It wasn't just wrong. It was inhuman. And it reminded him of something from Earth's past. Orphans taken from war zones, families destroyed by cold systems that never cared about the people they were supposed to protect. "What do I have to do?" he asked. Selvera looked at him, her eyes cautious but hopeful. "You'll need to go before the Council of Guardians. Say that you've chosen to take responsibility for us. They'll scan your memory, read your truth. If they sense any dishonesty, the request will be denied." Ray nodded. "I'm not lying." "They'll also test you," she said. "You're not one of us. They'll want proof you're strong enough to protect us. Not just physically, but in spirit. They'll challenge your mind, your courage, maybe even your past. Ray swallowed. He had things in his past he didn't want to revisit. Mistakes, regrets, the kind of things the council might dig up. But he also knew he couldn't walk away from this now. These kids, he said, glancing at the sleeping little ones, they deserve more than what this world gave them. Selvera said nothing. She simply watched him with tired eyes that had seen too much pain. As the night dragged on, the shelter stayed quiet. But far away, deep in the dark towers of the city, a shadow moved. A Xylonian officer, tall, armored, and cold-eyed, walked through the upper levels of the council chambers. His name was Valor, and he had watched Selvera for weeks. Not out of kindness, out of pride. She had once refused him, refused to become his second mate, a low-born widow daring to reject a noble officer. And now she had turned to a human. He would not allow it. She will not pass the trials, he said to the others. And the human, he'll break. But if he doesn't? A younger guard asked. Valor smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. Then I'll make sure he does. The next morning, Ray stood outside the grand hall of the council. The building shimmered like glass and bone, carved from ancient crystal mined from the planet's core. It was silent, still, almost alive. Selvera stayed behind with the children. Her voice had been soft when she told him, "If they reject you, we'll have to run." Ray had looked her in the eyes and said, "Then we'll run together." Inside the chamber, the air felt heavy. A circle of elders sat above him on stone thrones, watching him without emotion. Their skin was like polished marble, and their eyes glowed faintly blue. They spoke without moving their mouths. "You are human," one said. "You come from a race known for violence and kindness, for destruction and sacrifice." Ray kept his voice steady. "I'm here to protect them. That's all. You are not one of us. You have no history here, no claim. Why should we trust you?" "Because I care," he said. "And because nobody else does." The room was quiet for a long time. Then another voice spoke. One of the elders stood. "Words are not enough. If you wish to be their protector, you must prove your heart. We offer you 3 trials." Ray nodded. "What kind of trials?" "The first will test your strength, the second, your will, and the third, your soul." The chamber doors creaked open behind him. A soft light glowed from the tunnel beyond. "Do you accept?" the elder asked. Ray turned his head slowly and looked at the path ahead. He didn't know what waited for him. Pain, death, something worse. But he remembered the look in Selvera's eyes, the quiet trust in the children's faces. "I accept," he said. As he stepped into the tunnel, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang. In the darkness ahead, something moved. And far above in the council seats, Valor smiled. "Let the human try," he thought. "Soon, his bones will lie beside all the others who dared to care." The tunnel was silent at first. Ray stepped forward slowly, his boots echoing against the stone floor. The walls around him were smooth and curved, glowing faintly with blue lines that pulsed like veins. It felt alive, like the planet itself was watching him. He had no idea what to expect. All he knew was that the council had given him 3 trials, one for strength, one for will, and one for soul. He didn't know what they looked like, what they involved, or how to prepare. There were no maps, no weapons, just his mind, his body, and the promise he had made to Selvera and her children. The path sloped downward. As he went deeper, the blue light grew dimmer. The air grew thick, warm, heavy. Then he heard it, a low growl. He stopped. Something moved ahead, a shape in the dark. It was big. He could hear the slow scraping of claws against stone, the snorting of breath through flared nostrils. He reached for his sidearm, but it was gone. They had taken all his weapons before he entered. He was alone and unarmed. The creature stepped into the faint light. Ray's eyes widened. It was massive, easily 10 feet tall, with thick black scales covering its body like armor. Its mouth was full of sharp, curved teeth. Two glowing yellow eyes locked onto him. It wasn't just an animal. It was a trial beast, bred for this very purpose, to test anyone who dared ask for something the council did not easily give. Ray slowly stepped back. The beast growled louder. Then it charged. He leaped to the side, just in time. The creature slammed into the wall, shaking the tunnel. Dust and small stones rained down from the ceiling. Ray ran. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know where he was running to. But instinct took over. He turned sharp corners, ducked into narrow spaces, climbed up uneven stone. Behind him, the beast roared again and gave chase. There was no escape. He could feel it. But something else kicked in, something older than fear. His training, his human mind. He stopped running. Instead, he turned toward the sound of the beast and waited. The creature stormed into view, snarling, ready to strike. Ray didn't fight with brute force. He didn't need claws or teeth. He used the one thing humans had always used to survive: intelligence. He dodged the first swipe and led the beast into a narrow passage between two stone pillars. When the creature charged again, its shoulders got stuck for just a second, just long enough for Ray to grab a sharp piece of crystal from the wall and drive it into the creature's side. It roared in pain and thrashed, breaking free, but now it was bleeding. Slower, tired. Ray didn't want to kill it. He didn't even want to hurt it. But he knew one thing clearly now. This wasn't just a fight. It was a test. So he dropped the crystal, raised his hands, and he stopped moving. The beast paused. Its chest heaved. It watched him, confused. For a moment, Ray thought it would charge again. But it didn't. It lowered its head. Ray stood still, heart pounding. Slowly, carefully, he reached forward. Just a few inches. The beast didn't move. He touched its nose. It was warm, alive, scared. "You're just doing your job," Ray whispered. "Same as me." The glowing veins in the walls pulsed brightly. Then a loud humming sound echoed through the tunnel. A hidden door opened behind the beast. The trial of strength was complete. Ray stepped past the creature. It didn't stop him. In fact, it lay down where it stood, as if tired of fighting. He walked through the open door and into a new chamber. This one was smaller, round, quiet. A single chair sat in the center. Nothing else. Ray approached it, unsure. Then he heard a voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even real. It came from inside his head. Calm, ancient. "Sit, human. Show us your will." He sat down. The moment he did, the world around him vanished. He was no longer on Cylon. He was standing in a war zone. A memory. His own. Explosions lit up the sky. Soldiers ran past him, shouting. Smoke burned his lungs. And in the middle of it all, he saw her. His old commander, Captain Mira Trent. She was pinned under wreckage. Blood poured from her chest. "Ray," she gasped, reaching for him. "Don't leave me." He froze. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had died 5 years ago. There had been nothing he could do. But this time, this memory gave him a choice. Save her or leave. But the voice returned. "You cannot change the past. You can only face it. Will you break or stand?" Ray knelt beside Mira, held her hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I tried. I really did." The fire raged around them, but Ray stayed still. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He accepted the pain, the failure. The world shattered again. He was back in the chair. Sweat ran down his face. His hands shook. The chamber glowed brighter. A soft breeze blew through. The second trial was over. He stood, breathing hard. Ahead of him, another door opened. The final trial waited. But this one was different. There was no chamber, no beast, no visions. There was only Selvera, standing in the center of a wide garden lit by starlight. Her eyes were full of tears. Ray stepped forward. "Is this real?" She nodded. "Yes, this part is." He looked around, confused. "Why are you here?" "Because the last trial is not about pain or strength. It's about truth." She stepped closer. "Why are you doing this, Ray? Really?" He didn't answer right away. So much had happened. He could have left. He could have walked away. But something in him refused. "I don't know," he finally said. "Maybe I'm tired of watching people suffer and pretending it's not my problem. Maybe. I need a reason to stay somewhere." Selvera looked up at him, her voice soft. "Would you stay for me?" Ray's throat tightened. "I don't know what kind of father I'd be," he said. "I don't know how to love someone who's lost so much. But if you'll let me, I want to try." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I want you to try too," she whispered. The garden faded, and the voice returned one last time. "You have passed. The soul does not lie." Ray opened his eyes inside the council chamber once again. The elders stood before him, silent. Then one of them stepped forward and placed a hand on his chest. "Protector." Another bowed. "Guardian." And a third said, "Welcome to your family." But not everyone in the chamber was pleased. From the shadows, Valor watched with burning eyes. He turned and walked away, rage building inside him. The human had passed, but he had no idea what would come next. Not yet. Ray walked out of the Grand Council Hall with the official mark of guardianship burned gently into the skin of his right palm. It shimmered like a soft golden light under the sun. It didn't hurt. It felt warm, almost alive, like a silent promise now etched into his body. Selvera was waiting for him at the base of the crystal steps, her children hiding slightly behind her robes. The moment Ray came into view, her eyes lit up, not wide, not loud, but deeply, the kind of light that only comes after darkness. He stepped forward. The children peeked at his hand, their alien eyes glowing slightly as they saw the mark. "You did it," Selvera asked softly, her voice almost afraid to believe it. Ray nodded once. "They accepted me." And just like that, the weight she carried in her shoulders, he could almost see it melt away. She didn't cry, not this time. But she exhaled like someone who had been holding her breath for years. She knelt down beside her children and showed them Ray's hand. "You're safe now," she whispered to them. "He's one of us." The oldest child, the quiet boy, stepped forward and touched Ray's palm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That simple gesture was more than enough. That night, they stayed in a government shelter. It was cleaner, warmer, and most importantly, official. Ray was now listed as the children's protector under Xylon law. No one could take them from Selvera now. No one could break them apart. But peace is a fragile thing, and someone was already planning to take it away. In the darkness of his private quarters, Valor paced back and forth, his claws clicking against the smooth stone floor. His face was tight, his lips pressed thin. Rage hummed through his veins like electricity. He passed all 3 trials, his assistant said quietly, watching the noble officer from the corner. "He should not have," Valor hissed. "He is human, weak, emotional. Their kind should not be allowed to claim guardianship on our soil." He was honest, the assistant reminded him, and brave. "The council believes he belongs." Valor turned sharply, his eyes glowing with fury. "I don't care what they believe. That female was mine to choose. Her children were my responsibility. He stole what was mine." The assistant hesitated. "What do you want to do?" Valor's voice dropped to a whisper, cold, calculated. "We make him fail in the eyes of the law." The assistant blinked, but he already passed. "Yes," Valor said. "So we make him break the law. Or we make it look like he did." Ray didn't know any of this. He sat on the shelter's rooftop that night, staring at the 2 moons in the sky. Selvera came up quietly, sitting beside him. She didn't speak at first, just looked at the stars. Then she asked, "Do you miss your home?" Ray thought about it. "I don't know if Earth ever felt like home," he said slowly. "Too much war. Too many walls. I stayed in space because I didn't want to belong anywhere." Selvera tilted her head. "And now?" Ray looked at her. Her face was calm, but her eyes held so much sadness and strength. "Now," he said, "I think I'd want to belong here." She didn't respond, but she smiled. It was small. It was enough. In the days that followed, Ray moved in with Selvera and the children to a small assigned home on the city's edge. It wasn't much. 1 floor, a garden, and a view of the distant crystal fields. But it was real. It was theirs. Ray worked during the day, helping with deliveries, flying small transport crafts between cities. At night, he read stories to the children. They couldn't understand every word of Earth's tales, but they liked the sound of his voice, and Ray liked telling them. Selvera tended the garden. She taught the children. She smiled more now. Everything seemed right. But on the 5th night in their new home, the security alarm sounded. Ray woke instantly, grabbing his jacket. He found Selvera already on her feet, clutching her children. A message flashed on the wall screen. "Council investigation notice. Guardian under review." Ray frowned. What does that mean? Before Selvera could answer, a loud knock rattled the front door. He opened it to find 3 council officers standing outside. Behind them, watching silently, stood Vaylor. "We have reason to believe the human guardian is hiding illegal medicine in this home," one officer said sharply. "We are authorized to search the premises." Ray stepped aside without resistance. "You're welcome to look." They entered quickly, scanning everything. Within minutes, one of them called out, "Here," hidden in the floor vent. He pulled out a small black case, sealed, cold, and marked with the red triangle of forbidden tech. Ray's heart stopped. "I've never seen that," he said. The lead officer's face was unreadable. "It doesn't matter. It was found in your home." Selvera stepped forward. "He's telling the truth. That's not his." But they didn't listen. Vaylor spoke finally, his voice like poison in the air. Perhaps he wasn't ready after all. Ray was arrested that night. Selvera tried to stop them, but the children were crying, and the officers didn't care for her words. The golden mark on Ray's palm began to fade. In the cold silence of the council holding cell, Ray sat alone. He looked at his hands. He thought of the children, of Selvera, of the promise he had made, and he knew this wasn't just a setup. It was war, not of guns or armies, but of honor, of trust, and if he didn't fight back, he would lose the only family he had ever wanted. Ray had been in many types of prisons during his life, war camps, rebel strongholds, even space brig cells during his time as a pilot, but none of them had ever felt like this. This wasn't just a room with walls and a door. It was cold in a different way, quiet in a cruel way. The air smelled too clean, like the place had been scrubbed of emotion, scrubbed of truth. He sat on a narrow bench, hands cuffed behind his back with soft lock restraints. The council officers hadn't spoken to him since he was brought in. No questions, no explanations, only silence. It had been hours, maybe longer. Time was hard to track in a place where the lights never changed. His thoughts kept drifting to Selvera and the children. Were they safe? Had the council separated them already? Had they erased his name from the Guardian records? Ray shook his head. No, not yet. He had to believe there was still time. Footsteps echoed outside the holding cell. He looked up. The door slid open, and a tall figure entered. Vaylor. Ray didn't move. He kept his face calm, though his jaw tightened. Vaylor stepped inside, his hands clasped behind his back. His armor glinted in the light, polished, sharp-edged ceremonial. He looked more like a conqueror than a council officer. Ray didn't speak. Vaylor took his time. He walked around the room slowly, like he was enjoying the silence. Finally, he stopped in front of Ray. "You're far from Earth, human," he said. "Why not go back to where you belong?" Ray held his gaze. "This is where I belong now." Vaylor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're not one of us. You never will be. No matter how many marks the council burns into your skin." Ray leaned forward slightly. "You planted that case in my home." Vaylor didn't deny it. Instead, he lowered his voice. "That woman should have chosen me. I offered her protection. Status. She said no. Then you showed up. You want her, or control over her?" Ray asked coldly. Vaylor's face hardened. "She insulted me. Now she pays the price." Ray's cuffs tightened around his wrists, but he didn't flinch. "You're not punishing her. You're punishing the children." Vaylor turned away. "They'll be reassigned to government homes. It's the law." Ray's voice dropped to a whisper. "You think this will break me?" Vaylor paused, just long enough to show he'd heard. "It already has," he said, and walked out. The door slid shut behind him. Ray sat in silence for a long time. Every breath felt heavier than the last. He could feel the walls closing in. Then, the lights flickered. Not much, just a soft blink. And a moment later, a voice came through the vent. "Ray." He turned his head sharply. It was Selvera. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "How did you?" "I'm outside," she whispered. "The guards think I've gone to the children's home, but I stayed behind." Ray stood and moved closer to the vent. "They'll come back soon. You shouldn't be here." "I had to," she said. "You protected us. Now I'll protect you." He closed his eyes. Her voice felt like a rope pulling him back from the edge. "They're going to deport you," she continued. "Or worse. But I found something. I went to the city's security grid. I found the camera logs." His heart skipped. "The ones from our house?" "Yes. I downloaded them. The moment the case was planted. The officer who placed it. He was under Vaylor's command." Ray's eyes widened. "You have proof." "I do," she said. "But I can't release it myself. No one would believe me. Not without risking the children." Ray's mind raced. "Then you have to get it to someone who will believe you." "I already did," she whispered. Before he could ask who, the door buzzed again. The vent went silent. Ray stepped back as the door opened. 2 new officers stepped inside. Not guards, council enforcers. "The human will be transferred," one of them said. "To where?" Ray asked. The officer didn't answer. They led him through narrow corridors, into a transport pod. The walls were metal. The floor hummed. He sat down in silence, surrounded by silence. The pod began to move. But halfway through the journey, it stopped. The doors hissed open. Ray looked up and saw a familiar face. Council Elder Vorn, the same elder who had placed the guardianship mark on Ray's palm. Behind him stood Selvera, and with her, another council member holding a tablet screen. "Release him," Elder Vorn said. The enforcers looked at each other. "He's under review." "Not anymore," Vorn said firmly. "The footage confirms it." The human was framed. One by one, the lights in the pod began to blink. The cuffs on Ray's wrists clicked open. He stood, breathing hard, not with anger, but with something deeper. Relief, gratitude, and something else he didn't recognize right away. Hope. Selvera stepped forward, reaching out. He didn't speak. He just took her hand. The council member with the tablet spoke next. "Vaylor has been removed from his post. His crimes will be judged." Ray looked down at the mark on his hand. It glowed again, brighter than before. "I'm still their guardian?" he asked. Elder Vorn smiled. "You are more than that now. You are family." The pod turned and began its return. But even as they flew back toward the city, Ray knew this wasn't the end. Something had changed inside him. He wasn't just saving someone anymore. He belonged now. Not as a visitor, not as a soldier, but as a father, as a partner, as something new. And this time, he wasn't running away. He was finally home. The sky above the city was changing. Where once it had shimmered in soft purple and gold, now the clouds moved heavier, slower, like the planet itself was holding its breath. The wind had turned colder, sharper. And as Ray walked the narrow streets back to the edge of the district, with Selvera by his side and the council escort not far behind, he could feel something had shifted. Not just in the system, but in him. He had walked into this world as a stranger, a human with no ties, no name, and no expectations. Now he had something rare, something fragile, a family, and someone had tried to take it from him. Selvera walked close, not speaking, but her fingers brushed his hand as they walked, soft, careful, a silent connection that said more than words. The children were waiting for them at the shelter. They didn't know he had been cleared yet. They didn't know if he was coming back. Ray felt his heart pull in his chest. He had passed their trials. He had survived their tests. But what mattered now was how he walked through that door. What mattered was what he chose next. They reached the shelter as the artificial sun began to rise behind the high towers. Light spread slowly across the dusty street like a quiet wave. The guard at the front entrance stepped aside when he saw Eldervorn. No words, no salute, just a respectful nod. Ray pushed the door open. The small lobby was dim, quiet. Selvera stepped in first, leading the way down the narrow hall. She reached the third room, paused, and then opened the door slowly. 3 small heads turned. The children sat curled on floor cushions, their faces tired and hollow from waiting. The youngest, still too small to understand betrayal or politics, held a faded toy creature made of woven cloth. The middle child had dark shadows under her wide silver eyes. The oldest boy, serious as always, stood up first. When he saw Ray, he froze. Then, slowly, his eyes lit up, and he ran. Ray dropped to his knees just as the boy threw his arms around him. The other 2 followed. It was quiet, messy, clumsy, but it was real. Selvera watched from the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. No one said, "I missed you." No one had to. Later that night, when the children had fallen asleep beside the small heater, Ray sat outside under the stars again. Selvera joined him, wrapping a soft blanket around her shoulders. "They never slept while you were gone," she said quietly. "Even when they closed their eyes, they weren't resting." Ray looked down at his hands. "I never thought someone would try to destroy me without knowing me." Selvera nodded. "They knew what you were to us. That was enough." Ray turned to her. "I've faced monsters, pirates, war leaders, but Valor, he didn't use weapons. He used the system. Lies. Fear. It's harder to fight that." Selvera looked at him with those deep, unreadable eyes. "You fought it the only way that matters. You stayed." Ray didn't reply. He just looked at her. Not as someone he saved, but someone he had chosen. She looked back. Not as someone who begged for help, but someone who had stood beside him. The moment stretched. Then, something broke it. A loud, echoing sound rang across the air. A sharp alarm, not from the shelter, but from the city towers. Red lights flashed far in the distance. Ray stood instantly. Selvera's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Ray asked. "A prison alert," she said. "Someone escaped." Before they could say more, Ray's communicator buzzed. A message appeared on the screen, short, pulsing in red. "Valor has escaped custody. Target unknown. Warning. Hostile." Ray stared at the message, his hands tightening. "He's coming back," he whispered. Selvera didn't speak, but her expression said everything. He wasn't done. He couldn't accept losing. And now he had nothing to lose. They brought the children inside and locked the doors. Ray activated the outer defense field on the home, something he never thought they'd need. All night, the alarm lights flashed in the distance. All night, Ray stood at the window, eyes scanning the darkness. But Vaylor didn't come. Not yet. In the morning, Selvera received a message from the council. A request. They wanted her and Ray to complete a ceremonial bond in front of the full circle, something that would not only seal Ray's guardian status permanently, but also link him to the family by Xylon law. No future charges, no jealous noble, no corrupt official could break that bond once it was performed. Ray read the message twice. Selvera stood beside him, silent. "This means marriage," she said finally, "but not in your Earth way. It's a vow of loyalty, a promise that no matter what happens, you won't walk away." Ray looked at her. "Do you want that?" he asked. She met his eyes. Yes. He thought about it. The journey, the children, the risk. He thought about how it felt to be needed, and how it felt to need someone else. He nodded once. "Yes, I do too." The ceremony was planned for the next cycle. But in the shadows beyond the fields, far outside the city's reach, a figure moved beneath a shroud. Vaylor stood alone near the edge of the Forbidden Lands, staring at the soft lights in the distance. In his hand, he held a stolen blade. And in his mind, he held only one thought. If I can't have her, no one will. The sky over Xylon was still and golden, painted with soft clouds that drifted like silk across the twin suns. It was the kind of morning that made people slow down, take a breath, and believe, if only for a moment, that peace was possible. Ray stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the ceremonial robe that draped over his shoulder. It was made of dark blue silk, marked with the same golden symbol that still glowed faintly on his palm. The Guardian's crest. He had never worn anything like it before. It felt too delicate for a man who had spent most of his life in combat suits and flight gear. But today wasn't about war. Today was about family. Selvera stood nearby, helping her daughter tie a ribbon into her silver-white hair. The little girl looked up at her mother and whispered something Ray couldn't hear, but he saw Selvera smile, the kind of smile that bloomed from deep inside the heart. Ray took in the sight. Her children no longer looked like frightened survivors. They stood tall, dressed in soft robes, their eyes glowing not with fear, but with light. They had grown in only a short time, and he knew this was just the beginning. The Council of Guardians had requested a public bonding ceremony to end the cycle of doubt and corruption that had haunted Selvera's name and future. By binding her to Ray through the sacred vow, the Council would erase all claims made by Vaylor or anyone like him, past, present, or future. There would be no more challenges, no more trials. Ray wasn't nervous, not about the ceremony. What he feared now was what waited outside their control. Because somewhere beyond the peaceful fields, danger still breathed. Vaylor hadn't been found. His escape was no accident. He had helped, stolen weapons, and a hatred that had turned into obsession. And when a man like that disappears into silence, it only means one thing. He's waiting. The ceremony was set to take place on the upper balcony of the council temple. Dozens of witnesses, elders, guardians, and civilians had gathered by mid-morning. The soft hum of music played through the air as Ray and Selvera walked side by side, the children behind them. Their steps echoed through the open hall. As they reached the center platform, Elder Vorn stood with open arms, smiling gently. "You come today not as protector and widow," he said, "but as partners, as a family born not by blood, but by choice." Ray and Selvera stood facing one another. No one told them what to say. They didn't need to. Ray looked into her eyes, those deep silver blue eyes that had once looked at him from the shadows of an alley, full of fear. Now they looked at him with trust, with fire, with something he had never believed he'd find in a place so far from Earth. "I don't come here because I had to," he said quietly. "I come because I want to. You and your children, you gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Selvera's voice trembled, but her hands were steady as she held his. And you gave us something no one else would. Safety, hope, a future. Their hands touched, palm to palm, and the golden light between them began to glow again, brighter than before. The symbol pulsed, then burned softly into both their skin. The crowd bowed. But before the elder could speak the final blessing, the sky cracked. A sound, sharp and metallic, ripped through the air. A hover drone exploded midair, sending debris across the courtyard. Screams broke out as the crowd ducked. Ray instantly turned, shielding Selvera and the children with his body. From the edge of the platform, a figure stepped forward. Valor, dressed in torn armor, eyes wild, mouth twisted into something between a grin and a snarl. In his hand, he held a long plasma blade. It pulsed with unstable energy. He pointed it at Ray. "This bond," he hissed, "was never meant to be yours." Guards rushed forward, but Valor fired a blast from a stolen council weapon, scattering them. Ray stepped away from Selvera, his voice low. "Keep them behind you." She grabbed the children and pulled them behind a stone shield, her body covering them like a shield. Ray walked forward, no weapon in hand. "You don't have to do this," he said calmly. "It's over." Valor's eyes burned. "You took everything. My place, my future, my name. You lost your name the moment you became a coward," Ray replied. "You had a choice. You used fear. I used love." With a roar, Valor lunged. The blade swung with deadly force, slicing through the air where Ray had stood a second earlier. He dodged left, then tackled Valor hard. They hit the ground, rolling across the platform. The weapon slid from Valor's hand. But he wasn't done. He clawed, kicked, punched like a man with no soul left to lose. Ray took the blows, blocked the worst, then landed a strike that sent Valor sprawling against the council steps. Guards ran forward, but Ray raised a hand. "I've got him." He walked to where Valor lay panting, bleeding from a cracked brow. Ray looked down. "I didn't take anything from you," he said. "You lost because you couldn't see what love really means." Valor tried to rise, but couldn't. Council guards grabbed him, locked his arms, and took the weapon. Elder Vorn walked slowly toward the center and stood beside Ray. This time, the elder said to the crowd, "Let this be the end of greed, of pride, of power that forgets the people." Ray turned back to Selvera. She stood, holding her children's hands, tears running silently down her cheeks. He walked to her, placed his forehead against hers, and whispered, "It's really over." She nodded once. And this time, when they placed their hands together before the council, no one interrupted. The final blessing was spoken. The bond was sealed. And the world, just for a moment, stood still. Ray didn't just earn a title that day. He earned a home, a family, a purpose. And in the heart of a faraway world, where a broken widow once begged for help in the dark, a new life began. Not with riches, not with glory, but with something far more rare: belonging.